Well, good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? I was just going to have a real short live stream for a few minutes. I thought maybe I'd want to go over the mud flood for a little while. This is the Tartarian Empire, cover up by people and mud. So let's go ahead and just see what they have to say here. I'm just kind of interested in it. And if you want to hop in the chat, you can come on
in. There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Map 1652. Everything in yellow was under Tartarian control. 1652, people. After that, no one knows what happens. Was it a reset?
Really, guys?
Did the Tartarian Empire get too big? Who knows?
Recently, you have probably heard me talking quite a bit about history, quite a bit about the lost nation of Tartaria, a nation that existed in Europe that nobody seems to know about. It's a nation that's been expunged, and yet it still exists on many maps. Well, it still exists on many old maps anyway. It doesn't exist on too many new maps, but you can still find it on old maps if you search for it, and it does appear to be quite a well-known and well-established.
Well, I think it's kind of important to note that Tartaria is a real place. The Tartars were in northern Asia and eastern Europe. Basically, they were the Mongols. This is a very well-known civilization. It existed up until rather recently, kind of a tribal nation. But the entire concept behind the Tartarian Empire and the mud flood is this was an advanced Atlantean civilization with advanced technology. Now, I've got a series going on right now that's got some of this, but some of their connections are rather loose. For example, they think that metal firebacks and andirons are actually an energy generation system. So we're going to go ahead and continue and let this go on for a while.
Of course, any academic sources that you question about this nation, they will simply tell you it was an area of land. It was never actually a nation. And yet, as I've also pointed out previously, we can find flags of this nation. And if it was just an area and not a nation, then it wouldn't have a flag. So it was, in fact, a nation and not simply an area of land. And there's every indication that it also spread out to become a worldwide civilization. This is very much suggested by the similar architecture in so many countries around the world, very old architecture, which is all very much the same. And this is what is termed Greco-Roman architecture. But one would ask, why would every country around the world be building their government buildings using the same architecture? You find this everywhere. You find it all through the Americas. You find it through South America. You find it even in Japan and Australia. So why would they be using the same style? That's the question. And also through the discovery of a worldwide language, which was Magyar, or the root language of Hungarian. Which was spoken by the Incas, by the Polynesians, and also by all the Australian Aboriginals, and many cultures all around the world seem to have spoken this language.
Now, Max Egan, who is the Australian that we're listening to right now, is a well-known conspiracy theorist. He's big in mud flood, flat earth, and a lot of other, shall we say, rather out there conspiracies. Now, his assertion here is that Magi, which is the root language of Hungarian, is the root language of the Aborigines and many groups throughout the world. This is not true. There are over 300 different Aboriginal languages in Australia alone, and they're not related to anything else in the world except for maybe some of the local languages in Papua New Guinea. But let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story.
It was a physical flood, but it was not water, and it was an event that covered virtually the entire world. We can find evidence of this flood across Europe, across the Americas, even here in Australia. And evidence of this flood appears as buildings that have a sub-level, a level below ground, and also as many of the buildings that look like they were carved into rock faces, look like they were carved into cliffs. There's a very real possibility that they weren't carved into the cliffs, but simply the cliffs flowed over them, or perhaps the cliffs even became molten around them.
Now we're kind of getting into the meat of what Max and the other mud flooders and conspiracy theorists are trying to say about this event. They're saying that a mud flood occurred around 1840. Yes, relatively recently, where due to energy beam weapons, the ground was turned to liquid and it swallowed up all of these buildings. Now, the buildings that survived from this earlier civilization were then taken over by people that came into these lands and found, these buildings in existence, but nobody around. These assertions that he's making that the architecture was the same. That's because Greco-Roman architecture is considered classical architecture. It connotates strength and solidity. And that's why it's used in many government buildings and banks and structures that are designed to project an image of power and stability. So that's really not all that unexpected. Now, these buildings that are in the cliffs, you can see chisel marks where they were carved out of the cliff. Nothing flowed over them. So again, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
But however it happened and however it manifested, suffice to say there is a good deal of evidence to indicate that the mud flood is a very, very genuine event, and it's very likely that it occurred in the mid to late 1840s. And there's a lot of people who've been putting a lot of research into this, and a lot of information is being uncovered about what has truly happened in the past. And our history appears to be very, very different to what the mainstream has taught us, to what we've learned in academic institutions, what we learned in schools. In fact, none of what we are taught in schools of what our history is backed up by physical evidence. All the physical evidence says something quite different.
You can't have a good conspiracy theory unless you have a them. They are the ones that changed our history and are lying to us. They changed the archaeological record. They are hiding the use of various items that we find around in some of our older architecture, such as the ornate lightning rods. These are actually energy collection devices designed to give us all free energy that they are denying us, and they are suppressing in order to sell us that energy that we should be able to get for free. See how it all comes together? Now, this mud flood essentially killed all of the adults, except it spared the children. And the children were put on trains from apparently surviving cities and sent out to these unclaimed areas that had pre-existing buildings to clear the mud out. Now, of course, we have photos of the Orphan Trains, which was a social movement in the latter half of the 19th century. My grandmother actually remembers the Orphan Train coming to our town around 1910, 1920, just at the very end of it. But although we have the pictures of the children on the trains, we have and records of them, of course, we have no pictures of them actually cleaning up mud. So what they're trying to claim is that this reset occurred in 1840 by a simultaneous flood of mud throughout the world due to liquefaction secondary to energy weapons that were, directed at the ground. They also claim that these energy weapons are setting fires in California and are actually going to be regulated and triggered through the new 5G cellular telephone system. It's an interesting theory.
They call that a theory?
They call that a theory. It's just absolutely amazing to me.
And ultimately, folks, if there's one artifact that is out of place, then the official version is wrong. And there are literally hundreds of artifacts that are out of place, if the official version is to be believed at all. And again, these are all sort of listed as anomalous objects and great mysteries and all shrouded in secrecy and presented as something that we just don't know how they did it. But really, if you can face the very real possibility that they don't fit because the timeline and the history that we're given is completely wrong. How long would it take to change history and hide history? And effectively, it would take 3 generations, but you could actually do it in one. If you were to remove the older people, well, most of the older people anyway, a high percentage of the population, just wipe them out and simply replace them with children. The children wouldn't know what history was, especially if they were children that have just been put in place after some sort of a cataclysm like a mud flood. And these children would believe any history that they were taught.
Well, guys, that's the mud flood in a nutshell, and a nutshell is a good place for it. Now, this video continues on for more than an hour, and I'm going to be going over segments of it for the next few weeks, and I hope you'll join me. Maybe check out my other Tartaria series, and there'll be a link to that in the description. So, in the meantime, go ahead and hit that little like and subscribe button down in the lower right corner. I'd love to have you on Team Bob. You can hit up our Patreon or our website if you feel like looking at it and maybe supporting the channel a little bit. It seems like we had a couple of little technical glitches with this, trying to run a meet at the same time. That gets better later on in the video. I'm trying out a few new things to make the channel a little bit better and more interesting. So, this is Bob the Science Guy signing out from Northern Michigan. Thank you very much for stopping by, and I hope to see you again soon.